My mother was born on the 25th of May in 1894 in St George's Road in Camberwell. Her name was Dora May Smith. She was quite unfortunate, and so was her mother, in the fact that her father had been bitten by a horse he was trying to rescue, and the horse, maddened by fear and pain, had bitten him quite badly, and it happened to be suffering from something called glanders. 6 weeks later, my mother's father died of something which was called gangrene poisoning, which meant that now her mother, with several children, I think altogether there were about 11, had to manage without her husband. She managed pretty well by going and buying things on stalls in markets, taking them home, washing and, laundering them, or mending them. She also mended items which she then, had to polish sometimes. And with these things, she managed to make enough money to support her children as best she could. The boys had to leave the schools they were at, and they all went to the ones that were still of school age, to the local church school, where my mother also went when she was 5. My grandmother was quite definite about the fact that it was no good going to the state for help. What they said to her was, and she hadn't wanted to go, but people said, you must. So she showed them that she was right in what she felt. They said, sell everything you've got, and when you have nothing but empty rooms, then come back and we will help you. Well, that was nonsense. I mean, how on earth can you, after years of working hard to build up your home and collecting nice things to furnish it with, how on earth can you get rid of everything and you'd have nothing to be proud of? So my mother grew up in this home where somehow her mother managed to maintain them, and where they were all united together. They were a happy family, and she said that she never remembered being miserable or hungry until she was, as I say, she was born in 1894, so she was 20 when the war started. And, the 1914-1918 war. And this war obviously meant that the troops had to be fed. There were lots of people who were troops who were now not working on farms or in market gardens or anything like that. So there was a great deal around of poverty, lack of proper food, etc., and the population was not particularly happy. On the other hand, my mother said that although their rations were short, they managed somehow to exist, and the war, when it came to an end, left them all filled with happiness and the thought that now they could get on with life again. However, the war, as I say, ended in 1918 and 1918, and in 1919 my father came out of the army, and he and my mother were married. They lived at first in Hendon, but nearly 4 years later, I was born, actually, exactly 3 years and 10 months later. And, of course, my mother was an object of great worry to her stepfather then, because there she was on the other side of the river, away from everyone she knew. And so eventually he got my father to move from Hendon and come first of all to Kennington, and then near where his sister and brother-in-law lived. And then after that they got some rooms in a house in St George's Road, near my mother's stepfather and mother. However, sadly, before I was 2 years old, my mother's stepfather died. He had a terrible problem with his chest, and this was what killed him. She was after that terribly upset because he had taken so much trouble with her and with the two brothers who were near in age to her. He'd gone about with them and played games with them and taken them for walks and done the sort of things that mothers and fathers did do with their children. And it was a real loss to her. However, as I say, when she had me, my father decided that they would try and get a little place in the country as well. So he remembered that my mother had spent time in Christchurch, and he went down that way, and eventually he bought a place in a place called Verwood, which was on the edge of the New Forest. And we had this holiday home. I can see it now. There was a little cottage, and then there was an orchard, a fair size this was, and 3 fields. And my mother grew some vegetables in one of the fields, but I wouldn't say that she did an awful lot of the work herself. She did go out and do a bit of weeding, only, as I've said before, she wasn't all that good about weeding. She sometimes removed the plants and left the weeds, but she did her best. And also, beside the orchard, there was this place where there was a pigsty, and in there lived a pig who was known as the Honourable Grunter. I was very partial to this pig. I thought she was lovely, and I was indeed very fond of her. But I really loathed having to put up with my mother's chickens. They squawked, and they chased after me. They didn't like me near my mother, whether they thought I was trying to eat the awful food they were given, sort of, I can't describe what it was like, a sort of seed, and whether they, expected that's what I was about, I don't know. Anyway, I didn't like them, but I wouldn't have been cruel to them, because the one thing I knew from my mother and everybody else was you should never be cruel to animals. One other thing that my mother always said, and that was that if you haven't got anything to say that's nice about someone, don't say anything at all. So I did try to do that, but of course sometimes I met people I really loathed, and I thought, it's all very well for Mummy to say that, but I tried not to let her hear me when I said things she wouldn't have approved of. There was another nice thing about her. People do use language that's called swearing, and I've always thought my mother was quite right. She said people wouldn't swear if they had a decent vocabulary. They would have the right words to use. And I did agree with her. I've always agreed with her. I still do about that. I mean, words are lovely things. You listen to them, and they they have a real pattern. They make a picture when you see them written down. And I think, why spoil it by having swear words in use? I will also say that when I was growing up, I was very keen on my mother's way of doing things because she was home all day. I was never left alone. I never came home to a house where I had to unlock it myself. There was always someone there. It was cheerful. And of course, my father was around. And somehow, he was a man who would say to me, "Coming for a walk?" And I would say, "Oh, yes, please." And we would go and walk and look round markets and that, and see what was on offer there. And my mother would say, "Now, I don't want you to bring any rubbish home." Unfortunately, my father and I couldn't resist bits of